The wind cut across the plains like a blade, carrying with it the bitter cold of early winter. Snow lay in patches over the uneven ground, turning the landscape into a harsh, white wilderness. The sun had just begun its slow descent toward the horizon, painting the sky with streaks of pink and gold, but it did little to warm the frozen earth. Every step the cowboy took was heavy, sinking slightly into the cold, powdery snow. He had been riding for days, alone, following the faint trails of cattle and signs of life across the sprawling, lonely plains. His name was Eli Thompson, a man used to solitude and the unpredictable moods of the land. Eli's weathered face told the story of years spent under the unforgiving sun and wind. His eyes, a piercing shade of gray, scanned the horizon constantly. He had learned long ago that in these parts, danger was rarely loud or obvious. It often came quietly, like the cold that seeped into his bones, or like the shadows that stretched across the snowy hills. As he guided his horse along a narrow path, he noticed something unusual. A small figure struggled in the distance, barely distinguishable against the whiteness of the snow. At first, he thought it might be a stray animal, a traveler in need, or perhaps someone lost. But as he drew closer, he realized it was a woman, walking unsteadily, her movements slow and heavy, as though each step took all her strength. The woman was thin and wrapped in a tattered blanket that did little to protect her from the cold. Her dark hair was matted with ice, and her face, pale from the biting wind, showed both exhaustion and fear. Eli slowed his horse, unsure if approaching was wise. There were dangers in helping strangers, especially in these lonely, frozen lands. People could be desperate, sometimes dangerous, and the cowboy had long learned caution. Yet, he could not bring himself to ride past someone in such distress. The thought of leaving her out here to freeze, to struggle alone against the unforgiving winter, pricked at something deep inside him. He dismounted carefully, the snow crunching beneath his boots. The woman turned her head slightly, revealing dark, wary eyes. There was a flicker of recognition, perhaps relief, but it was fleeting. She did not speak. Words seemed beyond her strength, or maybe she did not know if she could trust him. Eli approached slowly, holding his hands visible, showing no threat. "Ma'am, are you all right?" he asked, his voice steady but gentle. "You're far from anywhere safe." The woman's lips trembled, and she shook her head slightly. Her movements were slow, deliberate, and fragile. She tried to pull the blanket closer around her, but the wind tore at it, and she shivered uncontrollably. Eli's heart clenched at the sight. He knew that the cold could kill a person faster than hunger, and the snow was relentless. He moved closer, offering a hand. "Here, take my hand. I'll get you somewhere warm." For a moment, she hesitated. Her eyes, dark and cautious, met his. In them, Eli saw fear, exhaustion, and something he could not immediately name, a kind of silent plea. Then, with trembling fingers, she placed her hand in his. It was cold, almost numb to the touch, and she leaned slightly on him for support. Slowly, Eli guided her toward his horse. She moved unsteadily, each step a struggle, and he supported her as best he could. The snow was deep in places, and every step seemed to sap the strength from her frail body. Finally, she reached the horse, and he helped her lift herself into the saddle. She clung to the blanket, and Eli handed her a spare scarf from his saddlebag, wrapping it loosely around her shoulders to block the wind. As they rode together, Eli kept glancing at her. She said nothing, her eyes fixed on the ground, and he respected her silence. Words were unnecessary sometimes. Presence was enough. He knew that many people in her position might distrust him at first, especially someone from another world, another culture. Her hesitation spoke volumes, telling him that this woman had endured hardship and loss far beyond what he had seen. The wind howled across the plains, and the horse trudged slowly through the snow. Eli guided them toward a small cabin he had passed days ago. a modest structure built from rough-hewn logs. Smoke curled faintly from the chimney, suggesting that he was not imagining it. This cabin was his temporary refuge, a place where he kept supplies, warm blankets, and a fire that could stave off the icy grip of the winter. When they reached the cabin, Eli dismounted and helped the woman down. Her legs trembled, and her teeth chattered uncontrollably. She clutched the blanket tightly around her, seeking whatever warmth it could provide. Eli ushered her inside, closing the door against the biting wind. The interior was small but warm, lit by a fire that crackled in the hearth. The room smelled faintly of wood smoke and dried herbs. Eli led the woman to a chair near the fire and helped her sit. Her body shook as heat slowly seeped into her frozen limbs. For the first time, she allowed herself to exhale, a quiet, shaky breath that spoke of relief and exhaustion. Eli retrieved a thick blanket from a nearby shelf and wrapped it around her. He offered her a cup of water and some dry bread. She took them with hesitant hands, sipping and nibbling slowly. Her eyes met his briefly, and Eli saw a glimmer of trust, forming a fragile but real connection between two strangers thrown together by circumstance. As she ate, Eli took a moment to study her. Her clothing suggested she was from a native Apache tribe. The way she moved, the quiet strength in her posture despite her exhaustion, hinted at a life of survival and resilience. Eli had encountered many people in his travels, but he rarely met someone with such a combination of vulnerability and inner strength. He realized that this encounter was more than just chance. It was a meeting of two very different worlds, in a moment of shared humanity. Hours passed, and the snowstorm outside grew stronger. Eli stoked the fire, adding more wood to keep the cabin warm. The woman slowly relaxed, letting the warmth of the fire seep into her chilled body. She did not speak much, but her presence filled the room with a quiet tension and anticipation. Eli understood that trust had to be earned, that patience was essential. As night fell, the cabin became a small island of light and warmth in the vast, cold wilderness. The wind outside screamed across the plains, rattling the logs of the cabin and sending flurries of snow against the windows. Inside, the cowboy and the woman shared a fragile silence, a momentary pause from the harsh realities of the world beyond the cabin walls. It was a beginning, small and tentative, but real. Eli could not help but think about the journey that had brought her here. How had she become separated from her people? What hardships had she endured in this frozen land? He did not ask, sensing that her story would come when she was ready. For now, the simple act of offering warmth, food, and shelter was enough. In a world that often valued strength and survival above all else, this moment reminded him of something deeper, the quiet, enduring power of human compassion. And so, in the small cabin on the snow-covered plains, two lives intersected. One, shaped by years of solitary struggle against nature. The other, forged by resilience and hardship beyond the understanding of most outsiders. Together, in that fleeting moment, they found warmth not just from the fire, but from the acknowledgement of each other's humanity. Outside, the storm raged, but inside, a fragile light of hope began to glow. The wind outside howled relentlessly, rattling the cabin walls as if the world itself were testing their small refuge. Inside, the fire's glow cast a warm, flickering light over the worn wooden floor and the few pieces of furniture scattered around the cabin. The woman, still wrapped in the thick blanket Eli had given her, sat quietly near the fire. Her hands clasped tightly around the edges. Her dark eyes were distant, reflecting not just the flames but the weight of experiences she had carried for far too long. Eli moved slowly around the cabin, tidying up the few supplies he kept on the shelves. He kept glancing toward her, careful not to make her feel rushed or watched. Silence stretched between them, heavy at first, but gradually becoming more comfortable. He understood that trust could not be demanded. It had to be earned. And in this moment, when the silence tells no, and in this moment, all that mattered was keeping her alive and safe from the merciless winter outside. After a while, Eli decided to speak again. "You must be tired," he said gently, trying to keep his voice steady and calm. "It's a long journey through snow like this. You've been walking for hours, haven't you?" The woman's eyes flicked up briefly, meeting his gaze. There was hesitation there, but also a quiet acknowledgement. She shook her head slowly, as if the words were too difficult to form. Or perhaps she did not know the language well enough to explain herself fully. Eli nodded, understanding more in her silence than she could have said aloud. "I can't imagine what it must be like out there," he continued softly. "But you don't have to be out there anymore. Not tonight. You can rest here, as long as you need." Her lips pressed together tightly, and she looked down at the floor. Eli noticed the faint scars along her wrists and arms, marks that hinted at a life filled with hardship and struggle. He did not ask about them. He did not need to. He knew that survival left its marks in many ways, and sometimes the stories were too painful to speak aloud. He simply offered her the warmth and safety of the cabin, letting her understand that not all encounters with strangers brought danger. Eli went to the stove and pulled a small kettle from the shelf. He filled it with water and set it over the fire to boil. Soon, the cabin was filled with the soft hiss of steaming water, a sound almost comforting against the backdrop of the raging storm outside. He rummaged through a small bag and pulled out some dried herbs, placing them carefully in the water. The aroma filled the cabin, rich and earthy, a smell that reminded Eli of home and simpler times. The woman watched him quietly, her eyes flicking between the fire and the kettle. When Eli offered her a cup of the warm herbal tea, her hands shook as she took it. She sipped slowly, the warmth spreading through her cold, stiff body. Eli sat nearby, careful to give her space, yet close enough to offer support if she needed it. Hours passed in quiet companionship. Neither spoke much, but their presence together built a fragile bridge of understanding. Eli thought about the loneliness of the plains, about the many people he had met over the years and the stories they carried. He realized that every person had their own burdens, their own silent battles fought far from the eyes of others. And in that small, snowbound cabin, he and this woman shared a moment where the harshness of the world softened, if only slightly. As the night deepened, the woman finally spoke. Her voice was soft, almost a whisper, and Eli had to lean in to hear her. "Snow. Too much snow," she said. Her words were broken, accented by a dialect he did not fully recognize. But her meaning was clear. She shivered again, and Eli quickly moved closer, offering a second blanket and gently placing his hand near hers to warm it. She did not pull away. "You're safe now," he reassured her. "The snow won't reach you here. The storm can blow as hard as it wants, but it won't touch us." She nodded. A faint movement, almost imperceptible. Her trust was growing, slowly, step by step. Eli knew that patience was key. He did not press for conversation or explanations. Some things were shared through actions, through care, through simply being present for another person. Eli noticed that her clothing was thin, far too light for the cold. He went to a trunk in the corner of the cabin and pulled out an extra coat, thick and made for harsh winters. He handed it to her carefully, and she hesitated only a moment before slipping it over her shoulders. It was slightly large for her, but it provided warmth and comfort, and Eli saw the relief in her eyes. After a long silence, she reached into her small bundle and pulled out a tattered piece of cloth, holding it close to her chest. Eli understood that it must have been precious to her, a remnant of a past life, perhaps a memory she could not part with. He nodded gently, giving her space to hold on to it, knowing that survival did not only require physical warmth but the comfort of familiar things. Night in the cabin was deep and quiet now, broken only by the occasional groan of the wind and the crackling of the fire. Eli sat near the hearth, his thoughts drifting back to the many people he had helped over the years, and those he could not. He understood that life often demanded choices between self-preservation and compassion. Tonight, he had chosen compassion, and it felt right. As the fire burned lower, the woman began to relax further, her body sinking into the chair, the blankets cocooning her. She closed her eyes briefly, letting the warmth envelop her, and for a moment, the cold, harsh world outside seemed a distant memory. Eli watched her carefully, making sure she was comfortable, his instincts sharpened by years of surviving alone in the wilderness. Hours passed. Eli took turns stoking the fire and sitting quietly, listening to the storm outside and the soft, steady breathing of the woman. He wondered about her story, about the journey that had brought her here. He did not press, knowing that stories like hers were told when a person was ready. He only hoped she would stay safe through the night, that the cold would not claim her before she had a chance to regain her strength. When the first light of dawn crept through the cracks in the cabin walls, it painted the room in a soft, pale glow. The storm had passed, leaving the world outside white and silent, the snow sparkling like countless tiny crystals in the morning sun. The woman stirred, slowly opening her eyes and glancing around the cabin. For the first time, Eli noticed a faint smile, a small but genuine expression of relief and gratitude. "Morning," he said quietly, his voice gentle, careful not to startle her. "Morning," she replied softly, her voice steadier than the night before. She looked at him, and for a brief moment, there was no fear, no hesitation, only the quiet understanding that they had both survived together. Eli went to the window and peered outside. The plains were still and beautiful, glistening in the sunlight, but the cold remained. He turned back to the woman. "We should eat something," he said. "You need your strength if you're going to travel again." She nodded, and together they shared a small breakfast of bread, dried meat, and the leftover tea from the night before. The act of eating together, of sharing in the basic necessities of survival, created a bond that needed no words. After breakfast, Eli suggested she rest again while he checked on the horse and prepared supplies. The woman agreed quietly, lying back in the chair by the fire. Eli worked methodically, tending to the horse outside, making sure it had enough food and water, and checking the supplies they might need for the journey ahead. By midday, the woman was awake again, and Eli sat with her near the fire. He began to tell her small stories about life on the plains, stories of other travelers he had met, of storms and hardships survived. She listened carefully, sometimes nodding, sometimes just watching him speak. Slowly, she began to respond, answering in short phrases, her broken language mixing with gestures. Eli did not mind the difficulty of communication. The effort itself was enough to build trust. By the end of the day, the bond between them had grown. The woman had started to relax, her fear replaced with cautious curiosity. Eli had shown her that not all strangers were threats, that kindness could exist even in the harshest conditions. And in turn, she had shown him the resilience and quiet strength of someone who had endured far more than he could imagine. The sun dipped below the horizon again, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The cabin was warm and filled with a gentle, comfortable silence. Outside, the cold still ruled the plains, but inside, two lives had intersected in a way that promised hope and understanding. The night stretched before them, but for the first time, the woman felt something she had not felt in a long time: safety. And for Eli, the knowledge that his choice to help someone in need had been the right one filled him with a quiet, deep satisfaction. The next morning, the cabin was filled with a soft, golden light that crept in through the cracks of the wooden walls. The snow outside glittered like countless tiny diamonds, and the plains stretched endlessly, a mix of white and shadows cast by the low morning sun. The air was crisp, and even though the wind had calmed, the cold remained sharp. Inside, the warmth of the fire and the cabin itself offered a stark contrast, wrapping the two of them in a small, protected world. The woman, slowly regaining her strength, sat near the fire wrapped in layers of blankets Eli had provided. She had begun to eat more steadily, drinking the tea he made for her without hesitation, and nibbling at the bread and dried meat. Her movements were still careful and deliberate, as though every action required thought, but they were stronger than the day before. Eli watched her quietly, sensing that she was slowly coming back to life after days of struggle. "I can take care of the fire while you rest," Eli said gently, sensing that she might be too weak to move around much. "You've been through a lot." She nodded, her eyes meeting his briefly before looking down at her hands. There was a quiet dignity in her posture, a sense that even though she was vulnerable in this moment, she carried a strength that could not be broken. Eli respected that. He knew that strength often came quietly, hidden beneath layers of experience and hardship. As he stoked the fire and added more wood, Eli reflected on the journey that had brought her here. The plains were vast and unforgiving, and winter was particularly cruel this year. Many travelers had been lost to the cold, to hunger, or to the isolation that the land demanded. Yet, here she was, alive and determined, even if she was exhausted. Eli felt a quiet admiration for her resilience. He decided to prepare something more substantial for breakfast. He went to the small pantry he kept in the cabin and pulled out a tin of dried beans and some cured meat. Over the fire, he heated them slowly, creating a simple but hearty meal. The aroma filled the cabin, and the woman's eyes flicked toward him, curiosity mingling with gratitude. When he placed a small portion in front of her, she accepted it with a small smile, taking her time to eat. "Do you have a name?" Eli asked softly, trying to establish a connection without pressing too hard. She hesitated, her dark eyes searching his face as if weighing the decision to answer. Finally, she whispered, "Naisha." Her voice was quiet, almost fragile, but the name carried a strength of its own. Eli nodded respectfully. "Naisha," he said, letting the name linger in the warm cabin air. "I'm Eli. You're safe here, at least for now. You can rest as long as you need." Her eyes softened slightly at his words, and she gave a small nod in response. There was no need for more. Not yet. Trust was growing slowly, like a delicate seed that needed time and care to flourish. After breakfast, Eli suggested she try to move around a little, to stretch her legs and regain some strength. Naisha rose cautiously, using a chair for support, and Eli guided her gently around the cabin. Each step was careful, but she improved with every movement. The exercise, small as it was, seemed to invigorate her, and she began to appear more alert, her eyes brighter than they had been since she first arrived. As they worked together to organize the cabin, Eli noticed small details about her, how she carefully folded her blanket, how she examined each piece of furniture as if assessing its use, how she paused to listen to the sounds outside. She had a keen awareness, a sensitivity to the world around her, that suggested she had learned to survive in difficult circumstances. Eli admired her attentiveness and thoughtfulness. Later in the morning, Eli decided to take Naisha outside briefly. The sun was higher in the sky, and while the cold was still biting, it was milder than it had been during the storm. He wrapped her in a heavy coat and helped her onto the horse for a short ride around the nearby area. The plains stretched endlessly, white and glistening, and the silence was broken only by the soft crunch of the horse's hooves on the snow. Naisha's face was pale, but her eyes were wide with curiosity. She pointed toward the horizon, gesturing at a distant cluster of trees and the faint traces of a stream that glimmered beneath the snow. Eli explained gently, telling her about the land, the hidden dangers, and the signs he watched for when traveling. She listened intently, asking questions with gestures and broken words. Though communication was challenging, there was a genuine exchange between them, a shared effort to understand and learn from one another. After their brief ride, Eli led the horse back to the cabin and helped Naisha inside. She settled near the fire again, her fingers tracing the patterns in the blankets, and Eli could see her slowly relaxing. He realized that the small gestures, the warmth, the food, the safety, had begun to ease her fear. She was starting to believe that not everyone she encountered would harm her, and that human kindness could exist even in the harshest of places. As the day progressed, Eli began to share stories about his life on the plains. He spoke of long rides through snowstorms, of nights spent under the open sky, and of the small victories that came from surviving in a world that could be unforgiving. Naisha listened, sometimes nodding, sometimes tilting her head in thought. Occasionally, she offered fragments of her own experiences, short words, gestures, or a soft hum of a memory. Eli did not push for more. He understood that her story would come in time, when she was ready to share it fully. By mid-afternoon, the two of them had settled into a comfortable rhythm. Naisha helped with small tasks around the cabin, such as stacking firewood, preparing the kettle, and organizing supplies. Each movement was careful but deliberate, and Eli encouraged her efforts. He could see her confidence returning, her strength rebuilding, and he felt a quiet satisfaction in witnessing her recovery. The afternoon sun began to dip lower, casting long shadows across the snow outside. The cabin grew warmer as the fire crackled, filling the room with a gentle glow. Naisha sat by the hearth, her hands warming near the flames, and Eli joined her with a small cup of tea. They drank in silence, the comfort of the fire and the shared presence creating a sense of peace that neither had felt in days. As evening approached, Eli decided to prepare a more substantial meal. He worked over the stove, heating dried beans, adding some preserved vegetables, and creating a simple stew. The aroma filled the cabin, and Naisha's eyes lit up with interest. When the meal was ready, they ate together, the act of sharing food strengthening the bond that had been forming between them. After dinner, Eli suggested they rest near the fire. The night was long and cold, and he wanted to ensure that Naisha regained her full strength before they faced the challenges of the plains again. She agreed, settling into a chair with blankets wrapped tightly around her. Eli kept watch nearby, tending the fire and making sure she remained comfortable. As the fire burned low and the shadows deepened, Naisha began to open up slightly. She spoke in short phrases, gesturing to communicate more fully, and Eli listened patiently. Each word, each gesture, was a step toward trust and understanding. He realized that survival was not just about enduring the cold or finding food, it was about human connection. About being seen and understood even in the most desperate circumstances. The night passed quietly, and when morning arrived, the world outside was still and serene, the storm long gone. Naisha awoke feeling stronger, her body more responsive, and her mind clearer than it had been in days. She looked around the cabin with a sense of wonder, noticing the small comforts that Eli had provided. The neatly stacked firewood, the clean blankets, the simple but functional furnishings. Eli prepared breakfast as she watched, and they shared the meal in companionable silence. Afterward, he suggested that they take a short walk outside, to breathe in the fresh air and regain more of her strength. Naisha agreed, and together, they stepped into the bright morning light. The snow sparkled under the sun, and the plains stretched endlessly before them, a world full of both danger and possibility. As they walked, Eli pointed out landmarks, small streams, and hidden paths through the snow. Naisha listened carefully, asking questions with gestures and broken words. She began to show signs of curiosity and engagement that had been absent when she first arrived. Eli felt a quiet pride in her progress, recognizing the resilience and determination that had brought her this far. By the end of the day, their bond had deepened. Naisha's trust in Eli had grown, and she had begun to regain a sense of confidence in herself. Eli, in turn, had gained a greater appreciation for her strength, her courage, and the quiet dignity with which she carried herself. Together, they had weathered the storm, survived the harsh winter, and begun to build a fragile but meaningful connection. As the sun set, painting the cabin in shades of orange and gold, Eli and Naisha settled near the fire once more. The warmth of the flames, the shared experiences of the day, and the quiet understanding between them created a sense of peace that neither had felt in a long time. Outside, the plains remained cold and endless, but inside, two lives had intersected in a way that promised hope, understanding, and the possibility of something lasting. The days passed quietly, and the storm that had once raged outside now seemed like a distant memory. The winds had calmed, and the sun shone more often than it hid behind the thick gray clouds. Eli continued to care for Naisha, offering her the warmth of the cabin, food, and the safety she desperately needed. Slowly but surely, she regained her strength, her body no longer trembling with weakness. Her movements became more confident, and her once wary eyes now carried a certain calm, a trust that had not been there before. Eli watched these small changes with quiet satisfaction. He had grown used to solitude in his life on the plains, but something about Naisha's presence had shifted the rhythm of his days. The cabin, which had once felt too small and too silent, now felt alive with the shared space between them. They were still strangers in many ways, each of them with their own history, their own burdens. But the gap between them had narrowed, replaced by mutual respect and understanding. One afternoon, Eli decided that it was time for a change. The weather had warmed enough that it was no longer dangerous to travel. The snow had settled, leaving the plains still and quiet, perfect for a journey. It was time to figure out what came next. He had no illusions that Naisha could stay in the cabin forever. She had her own life, her own people, even if he didn't fully understand where they were or how far they might be. Naisha, Eli began softly as they sat near the fire, the light of the late afternoon casting long shadows across the room. The weather's changed, the storm's over. I think it's time for you to decide what comes next. Naisha looked at him, her eyes steady. She had not spoken much in the days since her arrival, but her expressions had become more open, more expressive. She had started to gesture more freely, to share small pieces of her own story, her thoughts, and her hopes. She reached for the small bundle of belongings she had kept close ever since Eli had first found her. Inside was a small, worn pouch, and with a careful motion, she unwrapped it, revealing a few small, intricate items, beads, feathers, and bits of cloth. Each one a small token of her life before the storm. Eli recognized the care with which she handled the objects. They were important to her. They carried memories and perhaps a sense of home that she had not yet lost. I can't stay here forever, Naisha said, her voice softer now, but clear. I have people. My people are out there. I must go to them. Eli nodded, understanding more than she realized. He had known from the beginning that her journey wasn't finished. The plains were vast, and her family or tribe, whoever they were, could be anywhere. His cabin, though warm and safe, was not where she belonged. Not forever. I understand, Eli said. I'll help you however I can. I can show you the way to the next settlement. If you're looking for your people, I can get you closer to the tracks. Naisha hesitated. It was clear that she had been thinking about her next steps for days, but it wasn't an easy decision. The journey ahead was still uncertain, and while she had gained strength, the unknowns of the plains still loomed ahead. Eli noticed the small, barely noticeable flicker of worry in her eyes as she looked toward the door, as if imagining the world beyond the cabin. You don't have to go alone, Eli added, his voice quiet but firm. I can help you. I'll stay with you until you're safe, until you're where you need to be. I know these lands, and I know the dangers of traveling alone. Naisha seemed to consider this carefully. Her eyes lowered to her hands, her fingers slowly tracing the beads that she had kept so close. Then, after a long pause, she spoke again. I was alone for too long, she said, her voice steady but carrying the weight of things unsaid. The cold, the storm. It made me afraid. But I won't be afraid anymore. I must go back to my people. I must. Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. This woman, who had arrived at his door exhausted and broken, was now making a choice to move forward, to find her own way. There was strength in that decision. And a part of Eli felt a quiet admiration for her resolve. All right, he said. We'll leave at first light. You should gather your things. We'll travel light, and I'll show you the safest way to get through the plains. It's a hard journey, but you're stronger now than you were when you first arrived. Naisha nodded, and they spent the evening preparing. She packed her belongings carefully, folding the small cloths and wrapping the beads and feathers into a bundle that she tied securely. She also took a moment to write a small mark in the dirt, a symbol that meant something to her. Eli watched quietly, sensing that this gesture was more than just a practical one. It was a way for Naisha to leave something behind, a piece of herself for this brief chapter in her life. That night, they shared one final meal together. The cabin, which had felt so full of silence and tension when they first met, now seemed full of warmth and understanding. They ate in silence, the fire crackling between them, the comfort of each other's presence the only thing they needed. Afterward, Eli took a moment to sit beside her. They had come so far in just a few days. It felt strange to him that she was now ready to leave. But it also felt right. You're stronger than you think, Naisha, he said quietly, his voice low but sincere. You've made it this far, and you'll make it the rest of the way. She didn't respond with words, but she gave him a soft look of gratitude, the kind of look that said more than words ever could. Then she turned to the fire, and they sat together for a while, letting the heat soak into their bones and the quietness settle around them. When the morning came, the world outside the cabin was a shimmering white landscape. The sky overcast, but bright enough to make the snow sparkle like glass. The winds had died down, and the air was still, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. Eli and Naisha gathered their belongings. He packed his saddlebags, checked the horses' gear, and ensured they had enough supplies for the journey ahead. As they stood together, ready to leave the safety of the cabin behind, Naisha paused for a moment and turned to Eli. Thank you, she said simply, her voice steady and full of emotion, for helping me, for showing me kindness when I had nothing left to give. Eli gave a small, understanding nod. Sometimes, it's the small things that make the biggest difference, he said. You've made it this far. Naisha, I'm proud of you. She smiled a small but genuine smile that made her look more like the woman who had first appeared in the snow, lost and vulnerable, yet full of determination. Together, they walked outside, the cold air biting at their faces as they mounted the horse. Naisha clutched the reins, her posture strong and determined. The journey ahead would be difficult, but it was one she had to make. Eli led the way as they began their trek across the plains, the horizon stretching endlessly before them. The snow was still deep, but the landscape was peaceful now, quiet in a way that allowed for thought and reflection. They rode in silence for a while, the sound of the horses' hooves crunching through the snow the only noise. Eli could feel the change between them, the trust that had formed, the quiet connection that had grown between them. As they moved further into the wilderness, Eli couldn't help but feel a sense of fulfillment. Helping Naisha had been more than just a matter of survival. It had been about recognizing the humanity in another person, even in the most unlikely of circumstances. The plains were vast and unforgiving, but the kindness he had shown her had allowed both of them to see something that had been missing in their lives, a shared purpose, a small but significant moment of connection. Naisha, now stronger and more confident, was no longer the frightened woman who had stumbled into his cabin. She was a survivor, a woman who had found her own strength and was ready to face whatever came next. Eli knew that this journey was far from over for her, But he also knew that she was ready to face it, and he was content, knowing that he had helped her get to this point. As they rode on, the vast plains ahead of them felt less like a challenge and more like a journey they would take together, one small step at a time. They would part ways eventually, but for now, they were comrades, travelers sharing the same path, each finding their own way forward in a world that had once seemed so vast and uncaring. And for Eli, that was enough.